Hello and welcome to Education and Training.
Hello, my name is James Fowler. I'm the Officer Tutor at 27AC here in Edinburgh. And over the next 10 minutes I'm going to talk about what makes a proficient or average essay into a high quality merit or distinction graded essay. Over there to my left we'll look at a number of topics. We'll start off with the underpinning theme of all the things I'm going to say over the next 10 minutes or so, and that is that the construction of an essay, or indeed any argument, arguably boils down to three things. One, you have to be in possession of sufficient facts, well-evidenced facts at those, to make your argument credible. Secondly, you have to be able to situate those facts within a conceptual framework for analysis. And thirdly, even after you've done both those things, you still have to be credible or convincing, and that's what's meant there by rhetoric, which you see there on the far side to my left there. So we'll start to my immediate left, in fact, with the marking criteria, because some of those are not particularly well understood, and I will offer some definitions in clear, straightforward terms about what it is we mean when we talk about those things. So assimilating information, and what we mean here quite simply is how broad is the scope of your knowledge? What do you know, and how much evidence can you muster in support of the line of argumentation that you're making? Nothing more, nothing less. Moving on, analysis. Now, there are a variety of views about what this is, and so I will offer you the simplest one that I've heard. And quite simply, what it suggests is the following. You should have your thesis, i.e. the argument that you are putting forward. You should then be able to conceive of and note and take account of the antithesis of that, i.e. the opposing arguments to those that you are putting forward. And finally, and this is the most important bit, you should be able to reconcile those two perspectives in your synthesis at the end of it. So if you can do those things and you can show the examiner that that's what you're capable of, then the tick in the box of analysis gets kicked up to the level of merit or possibly distinction, depending on how effectively you're able to do that. But that at heart is one definition at least of what is meant by analysis and what it might look like on the page. Moving down into conceptual thought, another area in which there are a variety of views about what this actually consists of, but I will offer you the simplest one that I've run across in my time, and that is quite simply the following. Does the candidate or does the writer consider new or unconventional or counterfactual ideas? And this is quite often an area of weakness, or significant weakness I should say, in the essays that we consider on the courses that we look at, because there is a tendency, an understandable tendency, for people to accept that the status quo, whatever it might be, is in fact the best of all possible outcomes and argue in favour of it. But in fact, in order to show the highest levels of conceptual thought, you have to think of different conceptual frameworks within which to situate the facts and the analysis that you've undertaken, and that's what gets you to the top marks there. Finally then, written communication in this instance. Now, it needs to be fluent, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be convincing, and it needs above all to be formal. And this is another common flaw, regrettably, in some of the work that we get in, and that is that too many colloquialisms begin to creep into people's written English when they present essays. What is a colloquialism? Well, it's when you move away from a script that reads in a formal military fashion towards a script that looks rather like, or sounds rather like, a monologue or a conversation that you might have with someone informally in a bar, in a corner of the classroom, wherever it might be. So move away from those colloquial aphorisms, those colloquial terms, and keep your essay formal at all times. It is not a conversation, it is a nice formal piece of work which you have carefully considered before handing in. So, putting aside the marking criteria, moving over to the structure of the essay itself. Now, superficially, there's nothing new here. It should contain an introduction, it should contain a main body, and it should contain a conclusion. And I doubt that many people have a problem with any of that, but it's more about the weighting behind each one of those areas of your essays that tends potentially to lead to problems. So we'll start with the introduction. Now, above all, this really should not be lengthy. You can see there that I've said no more than 10% of the content of the entire document. And the reason for that is that from the perspective of a marker, it's usually quite easy to spot a weak candidate right from the outset in the introduction, because they tend to fill up introductions with long pieces of descriptive prose about whatever it is that they're talking about. Since the advent of the internet, I would argue that the requirement for description is almost wholly redundant, because anyone can find out what they need to find out in a thumbnail sketch of the topic in question at the click of a mouse. So don't use this as an opportunity to rehash the history of the Second World War. It's not an opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity to do two other really critical tasks. The first one is the definition of your terms. Now, I guarantee that almost any essay title that's set from a marker's perspective or a writer's perspective will contain words or terms which are open to interpretation. That is fine. All you have to do as the writer is tell the marker very clearly which interpretation you've gone for. That's absolutely critical. If you fail to do that, what tends to happen is later on in your argument, you become aware of the ambiguity of the terms and your argument begins to melt under your feet. And in terms of the marker's perspective, we will notice that and it will interfere with your ability to give good, crisp analysis throughout the piece of work that you're submitting. The other thing that an introduction is important for is a little bit more controversial, and there are differing views on it. I will offer you mine, and that is that an introduction, in accordance with good staff work, should offer a bluff of some sort or another. It doesn't have to be lengthy, but I'd like to know, or we'd like to know, that you have conceived of your argument from the outset and everything that you say subsequently is congruent with that original argument. And having a bluff is an excellent way of achieving that outcome. So you must have a bottom line up front. On to the main body then. Consisting unsurprisingly of your arguments and the evidence for those arguments. I say those things because a surprising number of essays that come across our desk contain plenty of arguments, but the evidence for them is a great deal less substantial. And I'd suggest to you that an argument without any evidence is really just an assertion and nothing more than that. Now, you might have half a dozen arguments, you might have 10 arguments, you might have 4 arguments. That doesn't really matter. If you're aiming for the highest marks here, you need to have worked out in advance what your underpinning theme that links everything that you're saying back together again is going to be and flag that up. That indicates a very high quality candidate who can not only formulate individual arguments, those arguments can be coherent, they can be cogent, but they're also underpinned by a central idea. And you'll notice that right at the start of this presentation, I talked about facts, I talked about conceptual frameworks, and I talked about rhetoric, i.e. persuasiveness, and all those 3 ideas underpin everything that I'm saying here right now. So what do arguments need to be? Well, the first thing they have to be is valid, and this is where we come straight back to evidence. Validity is about evidence, i.e. what can you show in support of your argument. And if there's good evidence from a variety of different sources, it's called triangulation a lot of the time, then that makes your argument valid. If a variety of different people all effectively say the same thing in support of what you're saying. The next piece, reliability, is harder to achieve in the context of a humanities-based environment, i.e. the one in which we're operating where we write essays, as opposed to a science-based environment in the lab. I will start with science and simply say that reliability is the idea that if scientists put forward a new hypothesis, what they have to show is that if they repeated their experiment, they would get the same result again, and that's what makes it reliable in laboratory conditions. It's much harder to do that in the area that we're working, but I would suggest to you that if you break your arguments down to first principles and then repeated them, would your conclusions still be convincing at the end of that? And that's the question you need to ask yourself. We can't approximate scientific conditions in essay writing, but we can at least look at our arguments again and say, if we reconsider the evidence, is the conclusion that I came to one that on first principles other people might also do so? Hard to achieve, but something to think about when you're considering your argumentation. So there's a third thing which you also need to consider, I suggest, about your arguments when writing an essay. That is, the last piece you see there, highlighted in red, is what you say interesting. Now, this is a highly subjective term, so I'll give you some more detailed definitions. Within academic discourse, the question that's asked of your paper or what's submitted to a journal is simply this. That might be quite a well-evidenced piece of work, but what does it actually add to academic discourse? What does it add to existing narratives? And you can see how here this plays back very neatly into the quality of your analysis and also the quality of your conceptual thought. If you're simply arguing for the status quo, then you may have made a very good argument, it may have been well evidenced, it may be congruent, but people sitting around are going to say, well, that is quite interesting, you've argued very convincingly that Tuesday does follow Monday, but that's something that's broadly accepted by most people. So think carefully at this point. Now, outside of the academy and in the army, we tend to be a little bit ruder, and you will be confronted by this, if you haven't already, when you're at staff college, or when you're at JCSE, or when you're on JTAC. And the question will come from your directing staff at the end of your presentation or essay, and they will simply say to you, so what? So what that you've told me all about Zambia? So what that you've told me about the course of the war in the Mediterranean? So what? So what? And this really links back into what I'm saying here. When you've written it all and you sit back and you read and review it, ask yourself that question. You put forward all these good arguments, but where do they lead? So what? And it's a very, very good opportunity just to review, sit back and make sure that you're adding something to the value of your staff work that you're submitting. So, aptly enough, we now come to a conclusion. This should be pithy, it should be succinct, and above all, it should have no new information. Now, what often goes wrong for people, even those who've worked really hard and ticked a lot of the boxes that I've talked about earlier on, is that by this point they're lacking energy, and it's understandable. But to get the highest marks, your essay has to be consistently good across the whole piece, and that means your conclusion as well. This is your opportunity, above all, to demonstrate the persuasiveness and your persuasiveness and your rhetorical flourishes. So we've talked about facts when we talked about the assimilation of information, we've talked about conceptual frameworks in your argument, and now this is the moment at which you need to write, above all, persuasively, because it's your final opportunity really to persuade the examiner of the validity and the reliability and above all, the interest of your arguments. It should contain no new information at this point. And if you don't include any new information, then you avoid, in doing so, a pitfall that entraps many essay writers, which is to come to a conclusion which is not congruent with everything that has been said before. However, if you don't attempt anything new at this point, you will avoid that, and it is highly likely that your conclusion will be, as I said, pithy, succinct, and also congruent with everything that you've advanced in the previous lines. Many a good essay is regrettably let down by a poor quality two-line conclusion, and some really poor essays are saved by excellent conclusions that are masterpieces of rhetorical skill. So don't neglect, either as a writer or as an examiner, to pay this part of the essay due regard.